welcome to this, what's it called? Motion debrief, I suppose, for round 2 of ABPDC about this House would abolish R&Rs, by which we mean, revise and resubmits rather than rest and relaxation or anything else those 2 letters might stand for. There is a long info slide. I'll just put that in the comments of the video. There's no way I'm reading that out. But basically, it's to the effect of when a reviewer for a journal gets a submission, they can either just say unconditional acceptance, so they just publish it. There is conditional acceptance, which is they say sort of all well and good, 1 or 2 minor things, fix those up, and it'll get published. And once the author fixes those 2 things up, they don't have to go back to the reviewer. It just goes straight into the journal. And then there's rejection, which is you just say no, bye, and it doesn't get published. Some more details on that forthcoming, but that's basically the motion. Oh, an R&R is basically when you just say, there are a bunch of problems, go away, fix those up, and come back here. And then when they come back, they'll get a new set of reviewers, or maybe the old set of reviewers, depends on the journal. So here are some handy pieces of context, just because this is a kind of knotty motion. I doubt everyone is highly familiar with the peer review system. I'm not. I guess a caveat here is most of my knowledge about this comes through philosophy, which is, I guess, not your representative field of study, but there's some sort of context that applies to all of them. So, and a lot of this does actually apply to STEM publishing as well. So the first thing is that journals often have very low acceptance rates. I think this is one of those things that's maybe unique to philosophy, in that some of the top journals have like 4% acceptance rates. Vast majority of things just get rejected. But even outside of that, often you'll have fields where the average journal accepts, say, 20% of papers. And what that means is usually people submit it like, they sort of like shoot the moon for the first one. They go for a really good journal. Either they overrate themselves or just think like, maybe I've got a chance. Then that gets rejected, submit to another one, see what happens there. And then they sort of like go down the list and end up with somewhere that accepts their paper. So often that means they go through sort of like 5 to 10 or whatever. There's a bunch of papers, even like really highly cited ones, who go through like 15 rejections before finding an acceptance. The next thing is that peer review isn't the only time at which you get the opinion of your peers in the field. So often people, and this is kind of, I guess if you think about it, it's pretty sensible, right? Because it takes a while to write a paper. Either it involves doing a bunch of like reading and writing and back and forth, or it involves, doing experiments and whatever. So you don't just sort of do this on your own. You get the opinions of other people. So you present your ideas at conferences, you present them to departments. Usually departments have like weekly seminars or whatever where people present ideas that they're working on. Or you just email people in the field. Often you've got friends in the field or whatever, and you share your thoughts with them, email back and forth. Another thing to add here is just informal conversation. Like people talk about what they're working on. Other people maybe raise doubts or want clarifications, or so there is, it's still collaborative prior to peer review. And the final thing is there are a number of venues where you can publish without peer review. The first one is public repositories like Archive. Basically, this is like biggest in STEM fields. People just, when they have a paper, they just publish it on this website and you can download it. And then they go about submitting it to journals or whatever. But for Archive, it's not peer reviewed. It's just as soon as something gets done, you can read it. Another one is conference proceedings. So if you present at a conference, you then just publish it, and that's without peer review. Of course, there's the trouble of like, getting your stuff accepted to the conference, but that's not peer reviewed. The other one is non-academic venues. So that means you can publish your things on like, I guess blogs or whatever, but like, books and wherever else. And those last 2 are, I guess, reasonably important. So, onto the actual debate. So the first thing teams will likely talk about is the quantity of things that get published. And this is a kind of tricky place for the debate, basically because like there are a number of issues that can plausibly be split both ways. So the first is whether this would lead to more or less publications, and this just depends on what the counterfactual is. Of course, it's silly to say the counterfactual. Of course, there'll be some that currently get R&R that get rejected, some that instead get conditionally accepted. But you're talking about what's more probable or what's less probable. And so on one side, you could say more like no R&R means that you get far more conditional acceptances than otherwise. The other says you just reject them. And I guess the thing to note here is that with R&Rs, often what that does is it sort of prolongs the time that, say, sorry, got to rethink this. If you want to say more get accepted, you want to say the sort of median case, or the most likely case, is that a paper that gets an R&R then ends up becoming publishable. Whereas if you want to say less, you say papers that get R&Rs sort of still stay unpublishable. And so they end up not getting published, or they end up just kicking around in the system for a longer time before the author sort of like finally decides to give up and sort of cut their losses. But then also complicated is the claim about whether more publications is actually better or worse. So for instance, if you want to say it's better, you want to say that sort of more research is better because there's more for people to see. You want to have access to as much information as possible. And there you want to sort of have the claim, you sort of need to defend the claim rather, that people are capable of adjudicating what's good or bad once it's out there on the market. Because if people are unable to tell a good paper, if people are able to tell a good paper from a bad paper just by looking at it, like you sort of want to have as much out there as possible because there's sort of no real benefit to keeping things hidden. But you can say this is worse because people aren't that good at telling this sort of stuff, like what's good and what's bad, and so that's why you need peer review. Sorry, that got a little confused, but yes, hope that made sense. Second area is the quality of things getting published. And so again, this one can sort of split both ways. So you can say the quality goes down, basically because you don't have useful additions being made, which are made in peer review. Basically, reviewers do make useful suggestions. They say, for instance, like, is there X that you forgot to consider? Maybe you should spend like a few paragraphs describing X. And that's something that, for instance, individual authors might overlook or something. But you could also say the quality goes up because basically reviewers are kind of parochial and silly and often end up, sort of insisting on a few particular things that only really they are interested in. Anyway, there's more detail on this on future slides, which is this. Because basically, because you can see those first things, if you're just sort of talking about the impacts and stuff, it's quite easy that the debate does just go down like both teams end up talking past one another, rather. And so the way to avoid that is, I think what you really want to do in this debate is characterize the peer review system as best as possible. And so one question here is how unique are its contributions? Because if you're on the side that wants to abolish R&R, you want to say that peer review actually doesn't add that much. It's just sort of like you just want to have it there as like a final filter at the end of the process, if you support peer review at all, because that's sort of increasingly a contentious issue. And so you can say its contributions aren't unique because these people have already run their ideas past a number of people, already presented at conferences, already solicited opinions from major leaders in their field. And so in that case, it's like the R&R system doesn't really add much. It's just likely to be sort of something that's in the way and throws up problems. But on the other side, you can say its contributions absolutely are unique, basically because when people, and here are two reasons. The first is that when you present your ideas, you're presenting them to an unbiased sample of the academic population of your field. Basically, if you can imagine there are some fields that are sort of like split down the middle on some particular issue. And so if you've got a paper, you're likely just to run it by people who agree with you. And that's not because you just want to hear people's praise. It's because you present it at departments or conferences, but you're more likely to be at a department or a conference of people who share your similar opinions to. You're not just going to be it's like, if you're a Kantian, you're not just going to be turning up at a conference full of utilitarians that's like, you're not going to be turning up at the like Jeremy Bentham Memorial Conference or whatever. But similarly, you tend to end up in a department of people who have similar views to you just because each department sort of has its own flavor. Your friends are more likely to be people, like academic friends, peers, whatever, are likely to be people who agree with you. And so it might well be the case that even after all of this long running it by people, you haven't actually run it by the people who are most critical or the people who have the best objections to your views or who are best equipped to find problems with your views. And then the second thing here is that it might well be that the author has come across those changes, but they just like those suggestions, but they just think those suggestions are really dumb and stupid because they're like, oh, shut up, you're wrong. Of course, academics have, more eloquent ways of dressing up that sentiment, but that is often the sentiment they have. Whereas and so they can just reject suggestions, even when they're good suggestions. But the thing with R&R is you can't just say like, well, that review is dumb, I'm going to publish anyway. It's the reviewer that's the gatekeeper. And so what you do is you actually have to address those problems with your stuff substantially, rather than just ignoring them, which is the case or which on op you would like to claim is the case. So that's the stuff on uniqueness. But then there's also characterization on reviewers. And this is like a, I don't know, real rabbit hole. Plenty to say here. So if you want to say the reviewers are good, what you want to do is sort of be a little bit optimistic. So you want to say they sort of genuinely care about their field and have integrity. And this is sort of the easy stuff, which is like academia. You know, if you're a smart cookie, academia pays real bad, and you get overworked. And I mean, it's like the sort of stereotype is it's kind of full of like catty people who are really annoying and impossible to deal with. And so the only reason people would end up there is if they really genuinely care about it. If they love, you know, the search for truth, or they love wrestling with powerful ideas or whatnot. And so these are people who aren't just going to sort of, you know, get mad and sort of grind their own axes in the comments for your paper. Rather, they're actually going to do what they can to give you the best review. And then, you can say they're aware of their own biases. Yeah, so some people, they're not just going to like press every view they have. They're sort of able to put that to the side and say, look, this is a paper I disagree with, or that I think pushes a bad conclusion or whatever, but they can still recognize it's of value. And then the final bit on here is basically noting that there are a number of sort of pragmatic incentives for people to be good reviewers, which is, sure, like reviewers don't get paid or anything, but there are really strong norms around being a good reviewer, basically because your papers get reviewed by other people, so you sort of want to be good about it. But also there are reputational consequences. So if you're known to be someone who's like a good reviewer or whatever, that ends up helping you later in life. It might make it easier for you to join editorial boards of journals, or to get tenure, or just to get a job at a better university or whatever. And so the reputational consequence, although peer review is anonymous, it's like, you know, word travels. They don't know exactly who reviewed what. But often it's the case that like editors might like be like, I had this person as a reviewer who's just like a real piece of shit or whatever. And academia is like, you know, not that big a world. So there are actually reputational incentives to be a good reviewer, and not just to, you know, make annoying suggestions or whatever. But you can also say reviewers are bad. Of course, you'd probably say this if you're on the other side of the debate, which is basically reviewers tend to be really risk averse. And this is in part for reputational consequences, you know. It's like that thing which is like how novice judges tend to give scores in the middle of the range, because if you give a low score or a high score, there are more consequences, so you just sort of tend to play it safe and then won't be any reputational blowback. And also they're overworked, so even if they want to go into sort of full depth of everything in the paper, they're unlikely to. And this risk aversion means that they're not going to go for the more dramatic responses of conditional accept or reject. Even if they're sort of like pretty sure they should conditionally accept, they're likely just to make it R&R. Or even if they're pretty sure it should be rejected, they're likely just to give it R&R, just because that's the sort of median option. It's the safe one. It just sort of kicks the can down the road. But then there's also the other thing, which is you just say they are blind to their own biases. Like they are, if there's someone who has spent all of their time working on this one particular part of some debate or one like sub-issue of an issue, it's probably because they believe it's the most important thing. And so when someone publishes a paper on some issue that doesn't devote, you know, pages and pages to their little sub-issue, they're going to get really mad about that, because they're like, what the hell? This sub-issue is the most important thing in the world. And so you can say they actually are blind to that. They are very self-absorbed. I mean, there are so many cases of professors who are like taking some first-year course that's meant to be like a synoptic view of their own field, and yet somehow devote 5 weeks to their own particular tiny little thing that most of the students think is quite boring, but they think is really exciting. So you can say that. So basically, the reviewers are blinkered is what I've just been yakking on for a long time about. So now for a sort of fun little break, because I'm sure many people criticize my presentations for being dry and being boring. So here's a peer review meme in the highest resolution possible. Basically, this is made by people who you can imagine are really mad that their beautiful submission has been torn apart and dismembered by these cowardly and anonymous reviewers. And so what they do is they make these sort of nasty little memes about them. I hope you can read that. Anyway, screenshot, enjoy later, moving on. So, final thing is there are other extraneous effects that this can have. I'm not going to go full in depth on these. I might go There's a little bit on later slides, but just some handy things to consider. The first is the speed of research. Basically, you can say it's likely that similar things are going to get published anyway, but this will just really speed up the process. That, I think, is probably the center of a really good gov case, so I'm getting to that later. Another thing is effect on retention of researchers, which is basically, if you just sort of like keep getting R&Rs and keep... So you can imagine, for instance, early career researchers who just like really do need to get a few publications out the door if they're going to have a serious chance of getting an academic job, need to publish things. But if you just sort of like keep getting R&R, and so you just keep having to make changes over and over, that's sort of gonna not just make it harder for you to publish, it's also gonna blackpill you and you're likely to just quit. Because if you just keep getting rejected for one particular paper, you're just probably going to give up and start working on something else. Whereas R&Rs sort of make you spend more time on it, give you that little bit of hope, etc., which means that it sort of means you're less likely to publish things, it means you're more likely to quit, because it's going to be especially demoralizing. The final thing is whether this pushes people towards non-peer review alternatives. So you can say, for instance, the fact that the R&R process is often like really long and tangled and arduous and just frustrating and annoying per the hilarious meme on the previous slide. This is something that's maybe pushes people just towards using archive or using conference proceedings or other methods to disseminate their views. So finally, some sample cases on the government. I think this is like the handy thing that I think neuters a lot of op, is you just say many important revisions have already been made, because you get feedback from all sorts of things. And also there's another thing to note, which I should have said earlier, which is when you get rejected, it's not just you sort of get an email that just says like game over. They give you the reasons for your rejection usually. And so you can still, if you are dedicated to reworking the paper, you actually can work on those. I suppose that sort of lowers the stakes of the debate or whatever, but that's just like a true thing about the world. I'm sure you can give structural reasons for why that's true, but one structural reason is just that it is true. So first point that I think this is one that you want to emphasize on Gov, basically because it's the least ambiguous in the debate, or it's like the hardest one for the other side to win. Just the system runs more efficiently, which is good ones publish sooner, bad ones weeded out sooner, because you don't have R&R sort of meaning the good ones keep getting reworked until they're slightly better, or the bad ones, people don't spend ages trying to polish a turd. And this has sort of two benefits. First is it just saves time of people in academia. You can characterize as very overworked. They have all these conflicting duties of teaching and research plus peer review. So if there's just fewer papers to review because the review system goes faster and there's fewer rounds of revision and resubmission, then people just have a lot more time to devote to other things. But also, if you're an author, you don't have to keep on rewriting your own paper, which just means everyone saves time. And you can say that translates into better education, better research, or just like better quality of life. But another benefit is research develops faster, because sure, there's like some circulation of papers prior to publication, but because basically academia builds on previously published results, basically the sooner you get results out the door, the sooner that next round of research can begin that builds on the published results. And so if everything just comes out like 20% sooner, it means that you can get a lot more research done in a shorter time. And the second point is you just get more and better papers published. Basically, you don't get that silly extended meme car with the sort of little something in there to please everyone. Instead, you get your sort of lean, mean racing machine that's just a better paper. Sample op case, first point, many non-publishable papers can be reworked into publishable papers, and you say that this is only doable through the R&R system. So the sort of strategy here is you want to show that people are authors are highly blind to the flaws of their own papers, are unlikely to be made aware of them through the methods that they currently use, or are unlikely/unable to fix those. And so what that means is for many papers, the alternative is they just get put in the bin. And so R&R is necessary to salvage those particular bad papers. Of course, there's the point to be made about making good papers into better papers, but I think the margin of benefit is much larger on this one. And the second thing, that's the one. Papers that are published are better. Sorry, I'm not sure what anticipate means here. Anyway, bonus things, because I think people are likely to say that's not much for each side. Debate too shallow. Why did I take a fourth at closing government? Closing government's cursed. I hate this game, and so on. So there are plenty of things to say. Basically noting that the claims on the previous slides, there's a hell of a lot of engagement to be had, as I hope the previous 20 minutes of this presentation have shown. And so that, there is like plenty of depth to go into. You can probably run something analytic. Other thing is there are just like other ways in which you can broaden the debate. So for instance, how this pushes people, how the, what is it, if you're on Go, so I think both sides could say plausibly that R&R pushes people towards non-peer review publishing. Maybe either side can get away with this. Anyway, the fact of the matter is, many things are published without peer review. This could affect that if you change peer review. It could change the balance of things going to non-peer review. Make of that what you will. Second thing is how this affects academia in terms of like retention rates of academics or whatnot. And then probably some more things, I'm sure. Anyway, that went a little over time. Hope that was interesting. Hope it was informative. If not, I guess bad luck. Cheers for sticking around. That's all. I guess good luck in further rounds.